pretty. You guys sang really, really pretty. Well, I am going to tell you a story today about two little girls, and their names were Mandy and Damar. And Mandy and Damar were the best of friends when they were little, and even when they're big now. But they loved the circus, and they wanted to learn how to do the trapeze. Does anybody here know what the trapeze is? Yes, what is the trapeze?
Something that people swing on.
Yes, you swing on the trapeze. And they wanted so badly to learn how to swing on the trapeze that when they were in recess one day, they were practicing to swing on the trapeze on the monkey bars. Now, this is not a good idea. You should not do this. Because when they were swinging on the trapeze, they were taking turns to push each other, which I don't think you're supposed to do in school. They took turns, and Damar pushed Mandy, and Mandy was swinging away. And every time she would swing back, Damar would push her forward, and she would let go of the bar and then try and hold on to it again, just like they do in the circus. When it was Damar's turn, they did the same thing. Damar was swinging on the bar, back and forth, and one time when she swinged, she missed and didn't get the bar. And you know what happened? She fell really hard on the ground, and she broke her elbow. And she didn't want to tell Mrs. Mercer, her teacher, that she broke her elbow. So she and Mandy were so scared, they didn't know what to do. And they finally had to tell her because Damar's elbow was hurting so bad and she didn't want to cry in front of anybody, that they went and walked up to her in the middle of recess, and Damar looked at Mrs. Mercer, and Mandy was sitting with her right there and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I think I broke my elbow." And she looked at me surprised, and she said, "What do you mean you think you broke your elbow?" And when she saw my arm, she knew I was telling the truth. So she took me inside really fast, and she called my dad. And then next thing you knew, my dad came, and he took me to the hospital. And can you believe who took care of that elbow? Mandy's dad, who is a doctor, and his name is Dr. Knight. And he helped fix Damar's elbow. Now, if it weren't for Dr. Knight, that elbow wouldn't have come out so perfect like it is today. See that? The moral of this story, the lesson is that there are always people around that want to help you, even when you're scared and don't want to ask for that help, because Dr. Knight and Mrs. Mercer were both there to help us when we were scared. Now remember, the one thing that you can always do so you don't get hurt like that, don't swing on the monkey bars. Now you can go back to your seats, okay?
As you're writing your sermon and you think you're done, you turn on the news, and then you realize, oh man, the world isn't even the same as it was a week ago. And it seems like, I'm not that old, even though I'm starting to feel like it, I guess. Whatever, I am. Well, whatever. And it seems like it was every few years you heard about some major catastrophe or some national disaster, something in the news. And I suppose that's probably not true. Those of you who are older are probably like, no, it's all, this is the world we live in. And maybe that's just something about getting older. And it seems like every few months, maybe even every few weeks, something dramatic happens. And and it's always hard to know what to make of media and to make of the hype that we hear. But it is what it is. And tragedies are tragedies, small or big. Lives are changed. And, this past week, we know that children have been, a child has been affected. And that is a big deal. that's a big deal because there is something innately innocent about childhood. It's actually, those terms tend to go together. And when people talk about, I grew up too fast, that means something because childhood is innocent. And so we're going to spend some time, of course, as I always do when I preach, talk about two things. And I was talking to Pam about this a few days ago, and I said, you know what, I think I'm stuck on a theme for my life. And the two things are children and Jesus. And a couple years ago, my sermon was talk to your child about Jesus. This fall, it was give your child to Jesus. And today it's going to be, variations on a theme, I think. But we decided, what else really is there, honestly? There are children and there is Jesus. And we are all children and there is only one Jesus. So I think this applies to all of us at all times. And so, of course, this morning I'm going to make lots of references to children. And many of you have children that are 1 or 10 or 20 or 60. And all of you are children. And so I don't think there is too much of a stretch to say that this will be something that really hits deep to all of us in our lives. And so I'd like you to put on your thinking caps. Maybe that's a cliche that we don't use anymore. But think back over your life with your child or your children, however much time that is, and if that's in the future. Think about your future time with children. What do you do with your children in, for instance, your free time? Many of us have a very brief time of the day when you come home from work, and that's your time. And if you don't plan that out carefully, I may not plan out every second, but if you aren't intentional about making sure that time's with your kids, you've missed it because they go to bed. Okay? So what do you do in your free time with your children? Just think about it. What do you do to develop their relationship with Jesus? And, another great thing about being part of a community like this, we get to share ideas about what we do with our kids and what we get to do to help develop our children, and so that we can all work together. Because the reality is, my kids are my kids, of course, and, mine and Jamie's, of course. But the reality is that you're all adults that are part of my children's lives. And this is part of being a community, is that we share these children in raising them, in being role models and adults and figureheads in their lives. So what do we all do in our free time with these children? What do we do to develop their relationship with Jesus? And so I made a short list of things that my parents did with me, and I've mentioned some of these before. We had family worships, and I remember just kind of watching the clock. To be honest, I remember many times my mom would get out the book and she'd start reading, and I'd be like, family worship. I was just playing Nintendo, the original Nintendo. There wasn't even Super Mario Brothers when I started playing. It was just Mario Brothers, I think. I don't know, actually. And I remember we had to sit on, I mentioned this before, we had to sit on the front row at church. There was no other place for my family to sit. It was front row, and my friends, it seemed like they were all in the balcony at church. I'm glad this church doesn't have a balcony because, and the kids at this church, if you've noticed, they tend to sit up front, which I love, or with their families. I mean, it's really one of the two, and that's actually a very unique thing for this church, and I love that about this church. I remember my parents giving us an allowance, and I'm talking pennies as an allowance, but they made me tithe on it and fill out a tithe envelope. And usually they would group all of us. There were 4 of us in my family, 4 kids in my family, and so I remember we used one tithe envelope because it was just full of pennies. But we learned what 10% meant. We learned what it meant to get some and give some, and that was really critical. I remember my mom got me a Bible. My parents got me a Bible at camp meeting when I was in 2nd grade, and it had pictures and words. I was really excited about that because I could read, and I had a Bible that I could read, and it was very exciting. And then I remember I got another Bible when I was baptized at 11, and that's the Bible that I teach from. It's at the school. It's in my desk. It has my name on it. And and kids, sometimes they ask to borrow my Bible for something, and I'm always like, you better be really careful with this Bible. this is the Bible my parents got me when I was 11, when I was baptized. It's really meaningful and it's special. I remember my parents followed us through Sabbath school classes as the teachers, and I know that is what we do, right? Well, so, parents, some of you, maybe you vowed years ago that, oh, I can't teach Sabbath school, but then, your kids get there and you're like, what else am I going to do? They need a teacher. These are my kids' friends. I'm going to be there for my kids. And so you teach in these Sabbath schools, and people tend to follow their kids through the Sabbath schools as teachers. My parents were the same. My parents sent me to Adventist schools, and I've preached about that before, so I won't get into that. But it is possibly the most significant thing that my parents ever did for me. I remember one of the projects my parents did when they were Pathfinder leaders was we did a Bible writing project. We would handwrite the Bible, and then see how far our Pathfinder group could get. We were handwriting, and we did have computers back then. They had the printers, but we did have them. And so I remember asking my dad, "Why do we have to handwrite these things?" He's like, "Just do it. It's good for you." And it was. I mean, you spend the time to write these things. And he made us write in pen so that we couldn't just scratch it, so we couldn't erase. And, it had to be in pen, so we had to take our time, do it right. And if you mess up, start over on the page. And it was discipline, and I value that so much. I remember my dad took me around. On Sabbath afternoons, we would walk around our neighborhood. And he would have his Bible. And he would say, all right, we're going to learn whatever it was. We're going to learn Romans 12 today. I'm like, why don't you take one of the other kids? But he took turns with us. And so he's like, nope, it's your turn. I said, okay. And we'd walk all around the neighborhood. And if I hadn't gotten it by the time we went around the neighborhood, we went again. And we went all afternoon until I don't know how strict he was on that, truly. But I remember doing that a lot. And those verses are still in my brain. I mean, these things stick. I think God is especially particular about helping the Bible to stick into our brains. I just do. All these things show that my parents were intentional. And so are you intentional, or are you accidental about your child's relationship with Jesus? And I know I'm speaking to many people who your children are grown, but you know what? I think we're going to see something today that applies to every child. And at this time, I have a handout for you. If the deacons could pass out your handout. I didn't put it in the bulletin because I know many people lose handouts between the time you get it at the door and you sit down. And, being a teacher, I want to make sure you have this paper in your hand. This is a handout that is going to help lead you through what we're doing today. We're looking at a parent, a very old parent, a very old parent. You will never meet a father-son duo, I don't think. Well, I don't know. I don't want to say what could happen. But I've never met a father-son quite like this. Having a baby at 100. Having a teenager when you're over 100. Oh, man. So as these are coming back, turn to Genesis 22. We're going to be looking at at Genesis 22 today to find out the perspective of a parent who discovered who the Messiah was and the mission of the Messiah through parenting. So I'll give you a minute to get those handouts and to turn to Genesis 22. We're going to pretty much stick with verses 1 through 14. And I want to see, and we'll see what you can learn about your own parenting and your own children and maybe your concept of the Messiah's role with your child today. Okay. Now, the risk of giving this to you is that you're just going to read that and you're not going to listen to what I'm saying. So I do have other things I'm going to say other than what's on the handout. So you do need to listen. You don't have to take notes. I'm telling you, I preach like I teach. That's just the way it is. Okay, here we go. Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2. I'm reading from the NIV, the old NIV now, if you didn't know that, by the way. It's the 1984 NIV. There's a new one. Verses 1 and 2. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. Just like that. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son. It's an interesting phrase, by the way. Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Okay, no problem, God, I can do that. Sacrifice him. Uh-oh. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Hasn't Abraham been through enough? Let's be honest. The man was not a spring chicken when he was called to leave his whole family and move to the middle of nowhere. That in itself is, hey, Abraham, you have a huge family. Well, actually, he didn't have a huge family. You have a lot of relatives. You have a home. You have wealth. So why don't you just leave all of that now? Okay, and then 25 years later, now God's coming to him with a child, and now he's years later than that. He thinks he's gotten past the hardship. You know, have you ever gone through something very rough and felt like, oh, finally I went through that one really bad thing that God's going to lead me through in my life? I went through that. That's finally, everybody has that thing, that one traumatic experience in their life. And I finally went through that. And now God comes back and says, you know, I'm not really through with you yet. I have more to do with you. And so God comes to Abraham and says, hey, that son, your only son, which is not really true, but in God's eyes, he's choosing this son, Isaac. And he's saying, this son who you are now focusing all of your attention on. Abraham already had the guts to send away his other son, and that was really hard for him. He made some decisions that he thought were what God wanted him to do, and he had to change his life to focus on part of his family. And that, how does that even happen? I mean, how do you deal with that? And now God's saying, well, you thought you had it all taken care of. Now, why want you to go kill your son? Patriarchs and Prophets gives a nice commentary on this section. If you ever want to go look at that section, I'm just going to read various excerpts from that. But I would encourage you to go read this. It just really rich details about behind the scenes. In the obedience of faith, Abraham had forsaken his native country. He had turned away from the graves of his fathers and the home of his kindred. He had wandered as a stranger in the land of his inheritance. He had waited long for the birth of the promised heir. At the command of God, he had sent away his son Ishmael. I mean, isn't this a pretty good to-do list? And now, when the child so long desired was entering upon manhood, he's finally growing up. And he's thinking about setting this child free to be independent and to make a name for himself. And the patriarch seemed to be able to discern the fruition of his hopes. A trial greater than all others was before him. Oh, man, if we could see tomorrow. If you could see tomorrow's calendar, I mean, most of us use calendars now on our phones, and don't you, you look forward sometimes, you look at the month, and then some days, you wake up. I mean, that's one of the things I do every day. I get up, and, the first thing usually I do it at night, because, there's usually something that I need to have gotten ready by the morning. And so I look at the calendar and say, what's tomorrow? And so you see the list of, if we could see next week or next year, what would that say? What does God have planned for us? And it may be something life-changing. And are we prepared for that? Genesis 22, 3 through 5. Let's keep going. Verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. I'm not sure I would have gotten up and saddled my donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Imagine what he's thinking, what he's feeling, what he's wishing would happen, what he's hoping that he wakes up from. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there." He doesn't want these guys around. He doesn't want his helpers around. He's like, this is for me. This is for me and my son. This is something that you are not going to understand. I don't even understand it. You're not going to understand this. Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship. Interesting choice of words. And then we will come back to you. So, what is Abraham's attitude as he's going to do the one thing in his life that he does not want to do? And this is why you never tell God never. Truly. Never tell God never, because that may be the one thing that he's going to call you to do. And Abraham, his one thing, we know his one thing had to be, raise this child, make this child successful, do everything I can for this one child. Everything in his life was focused around this one child because God had given him a promise. So, this wasn't just something he had dreamed up. God had come to him and said, this is going to happen through this son. So, sometimes we think that Abraham was in utter despair and helplessness. And, of course, that was partly there. Of course. He's going to go obey God and kill his son. But looking beyond that which was seen, Abraham grasped the divine word, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. Did you know that? Did you know that? Did you know that Abraham believed that God was going to raise this child? That's huge. That is remarkable faith for a man who grew up in a world where there were many gods, many idols. He had to leave all that behind. They did child sacrifice all the time in the culture where, I'm not saying he and his family did, but his culture that he would have grown up in, that was a part of life of that part of the world. And he had to leave that. And that was not part of his new life and not part of his family. And he decides to believe that, this God is different. And I think this God, he's the God of life, not the God of death. And so he wants to save my child. And so I believe that that through this event, somehow, some way, God's going to still fulfill his promise, even though I don't see how, but maybe he's going to raise this child. So, let's do what God says. Continuing, verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. Keep in mind, he's an old man, even for that time. And I don't mean to just emphasize that just so you can think he's old, but I want to switch it a little bit to think about Isaac. Because Isaac is not 5. Isaac is not an infant that's helpless here. Isaac has an opinion about this event, and he's going to have an opinion very quickly, and he has the ability to make some things happen or to not happen if he feels like it. And so Isaac, in verse 7, speaks up and says to his father Abraham, "Hey, Dad, just curious. I don't mean to pry. I know that you've done this before, and we've done this before." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "Yes." Abraham knows what's coming, and what's he prepared to say? "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but I just have to ask, where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" "Dad, did you forget I'm sure you didn't forget, Dad, right?" "Oh," Abraham answered, what would you say? How would you break this to him? How would you break this to him? "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Now that is an interesting answer. That is an interesting way to phrase it. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Seemed to settle Isaac, and he said, okay. Well, it says, and the two of them went on together. Look at page 152, the quote I gave you. It was with terror and amazement. Isn't that weird how those two things can go together? He's freaked out, and he's very curious. He's like, wow, what are we talking about here? It was with terror and amazement that Isaac learned his fate. But he offered no resistance. Does that point to something 2,000 years later to you? A child knowing his fate, knowing what's happening, knowing his impending doom, offering no resistance. He could have escaped his doom had he chosen to do so. Who are we talking about here? Oh, we're talking about Isaac. But it does kind of start sounding like it's not, doesn't it? He could have escaped his doom, but had he chosen to do so. The grief-stricken old man, exhausted with the struggle of those 3 terrible days, could not have opposed the will of the vigorous youth. There's no way this guy's going to catch him. There's no way he's going to be able to stop Isaac from getting away. But Isaac had been trained from childhood to ready, trusting obedience. Wow. That's trusting obedience. And as the purpose of God was opened before him, he yielded a willing submission. Oh. And so here he is, the dad with his promised son, who the promise isn't even fulfilled completely yet. He's ready to kill his son. And so verse 9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood on it. And imagine if you're Isaac, just kind of, you're watching, like, there's the wood, yeah, okay, there's the fire, yeah, he's got the knife. He bound his son Isaac, here you go, okay, let's tie you up. Okay, Dad. Laid him on the altar. Is this right? Yeah, no, that'll be fine. Over here, I guess that's okay. On top of the wood, then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Oh, my goodness. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, thankfully the most blessed sound Abraham ever heard in his life. Abraham! Abraham! And I like to imagine that he kind of went paralyzed for a second. Yes, Lord. Yeah, I am definitely ready to, because I think maybe he was kind of doing this, okay, he probably wasn't really doing that, but I think there was an expectation. He didn't know what was going to happen. And so verse 14. Oh, sorry, let me go back here. Page 152. Page 152. I don't want to skip my notes, because then you're going to be like, he skipped that whole part of his notes. Again, the voice is heard. Lay not thine hand upon the lad. Done, Lord, done. Neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God. Now I know that everything in his life hadn't been enough. Now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Anybody's willing to give their only child for somebody else is somebody we're talking about. Anybody willing to give the only thing that matters in their life is something to really study and figure out how our lives have to be part of that. And so Genesis 22:14. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Oh, just the faith of Abraham just went to a whole new level. And this man is mentioned in the book of Hebrews as a man of faith. And I think before this chapter, he had a lot of faith. And now that this has happened, I think he has a whole new understanding of what God is all about, of what God wants to do with his child and through God himself for us. Page 154. The ram offered in the place of Isaac represented the Son of God, who was to be sacrificed in our stead. When man was doomed to death by the transgression of the law of God, the Father, looking upon his Son, said to the sinner, live, I have found a ransom. And I put the title in your bulletin. How high a ransom would you be willing to pay? What would you be willing to give for your child? What would you be willing to give up to pay a debt for your child? And yet God has a call for us to give our child themselves. And as I mentioned, 2,000 years later, you've got a mom. You've got a mother who's been visited by an angel, who was a very young mother, who went through a pretty scary ordeal even during her pregnancy of how she would have been viewed and the dangers that Joseph would have gone through for defending her. And now Mary has watched her child grow up. Think about the faith of this woman, what it's like to raise God. What do you talk about in the morning? What are your daily worships like? If this is God, what are your prayers going to sound like? What scriptures are you going to read? This is a remarkable parent. This is a remarkable mom. And now she's watching her son be killed on a cross. Humiliating. Common criminal death. Ridiculous. And he has all these followers. He's done all these things. Where are they all now? And she's there with a couple people. One of his followers, this is, that's nice, but she's sitting there witnessing the death of her son and knowing some of the same things Abraham knew. This child could get out of there. He could stop this right now. He doesn't. This is blowing my mind. I knew this thing would probably happen because that guy back at the temple. You remember Simeon? Remember Simeon when Jesus was 8 days old? They go to Jerusalem to dedicate him, and Simeon and Anna both come, and Simeon makes some comment to Mary, just trying to help her understand that this is going to be awesome, but it's going to hurt. A lot of awesome things in the world hurt, don't they? A lot of the best things, the most dramatic things, the most life-changing things are not purely painless, are not purely seamless, because I think God has a purpose for that. And so she witnesses the sacrifice of her child. And what is she thinking is going to happen? Jesus had predicted his own resurrection. And so maybe there's some faith in there. And we don't know all of how that story ended between Mary and Jesus. But we know that Abraham wanted to save his child. We know that Mary wanted to save her child. And I'll bet that you, in any situation where your child was in danger, I'll bet that you would do anything for your child. If you were the one who was called by God to go sacrifice your child, you would instantly, I believe, as would all of us, say, no, have it the other way around. I'm fine with that. Take me, save my child. I am fine with that. This is not even a debate in my mind, God. You can, if you need to do something dramatic to prove some point here, God, take me. Save my child. That's even part of human nature, which is a good statement about humans. That's good. And it's profound when you start putting it into the terms of God. And so I think God is testing us today. I don't know how he's testing you exactly, but I believe he is testing us today. What will we give our children to make sure that they know Jesus completely? And again, our children are free individuals. They have freedom of choice. They have individuality. We can't control them. But what have we done? What are we doing, continuing to do with our grown-up children to help point them to Jesus? Do we believe that God's going to save our children? Do you believe that God's going to save your child? And that's easier to believe when children are young. It's easy to believe that young children are going to go to heaven. I mean, it's easy to believe, God, why wouldn't he save all the babies? Why wouldn't he save all the young children? I mean, really, this is truly, why wouldn't he? But when they get to be, teenagers, adults, we start seeing that, they're making grown-up decisions here. And so now I'm fearing for my child. Now I'm wondering, is he going to save my child? That's about the most important question that probably weighs on any parent's mind, is God going to save my child? And Abraham had faith. Faith probably bolder than what you or I have. Faith more life-changing. And Mary had a lot of faith that God would somehow save this child, and that child she knew was going to save her too. And I believe this morning God is wanting us to understand that Jesus wants to save your child. Jesus wants to save your child. If he's the judge, if he's the lawyer, he's going to make this decision. He's the jury. He wants to do this. He wants to do this. This is about the best news that we could possibly have, that the person who has the ultimate control wants to save us, wants to save our child. And I believe that God will reward your faith when you've done everything you can to give your child to Jesus. I believe that God has done everything he can to save your child. He gave his child for your child, for us. What else are we asking God to do? And so I think we have a shared vision in this community. I think this church has had a vision for a long time for this community. We have a school, we have a church, we have a hospital. These are witnessing agents that work for a community for a purpose different than what a lot of people might think. We have a place we have a unique community that presents Jesus. And so how are we presenting Jesus to the people around us, to people in our community, and especially, how are we as a community presenting Jesus to children? Is it as a loving father? I hope so. Is it as a miracle-working friend? Is it as an almighty Savior? So that when Jesus comes, this is the vision, that when Jesus comes, that we walk hand in hand into the kingdom with our children. That's it. And you think about that. Okay, this happened every time I went through the sermon in my brain. You think about that thought of what it means to go into the kingdom with your children. And you see the children that you have worked with. There is nothing else that matters. Nothing. And so I actually want to finish the sermon similar to how I finished the sermon that I did in the fall. If you're not sitting with your parents, go sit with your parents. Go find your parents. This is important. This is important to finish together. And obviously, many of you have children that aren't here. However, they probably are on Facebook somewhere nearby. They probably are just a phone call away. And I'm not saying to FaceTime them right now. That might be just a little crazy. We might take over the Wi-Fi at the church. And as we finish, what I want you to do, okay? Now this is really special. And what I want you to do is to take your child's hand, or to hold them. If they're grown up, you might want to hold them. Take their hand and close your eyes. Take your hand and close your eyes. And before we pray, though, okay, envision what it's going to be like to walk into the kingdom, into heaven, with your child. Think about the look on their face. Think about the look on your face as you look at each other, you look at everybody around you, you look at heaven itself, whatever that's going to be like, and you look at God, and you both look at God, and He looks back at you, and it just sinks in on what's happening. And this morning, I think this can be a reality that we can begin today. That we live our lives intentionally, knowing that Jesus wants to save our children, which is the same thing we want. And so let's live our lives with purpose and intentionality, down to the greatest detail that we can, and with the faith that Jesus can do what He says He can do. Jesus wants to save these children, and He wants to save us. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, this is a really profound thought, that You can do something in our lives so amazing as saving us from sin, saving us from ourselves, from the wickedness of this world. We've been reminded lately of how fragile life is, of how short life is on this earth. But we know that You have a plan. We've seen it in history over and over again. And we claim through faith that You are here to save us. You are here to save our children. And help us to be faithful to You day in and day out as we help lead our own children, with Your help, into Your kingdom. In Jesus' name.